Hello and welcome to this virtual session. We're glad you can join us today. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items we'd like to go over with you now. Firstly, you can resize the webinar windows to cater to your viewing preferences. You can maximize, minimize, and drag the windows to your preferred viewing size. If you look at the bottom middle of your screen, you can click on the widgets that you'll need to get the most out of this virtual experience. Secondly, Microsoft specialists are on hand to answer your questions in real time. So feel free to type in your questions using the Q&A window and we'll answer them as soon as we can. Lastly, we've provided some additional resources for you to supplement your learning. You can access them by clicking on the links in this section. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers.
Welcome back to part 2 of Microsoft Azure Virtual Training Day, Migrating On-Premises Infrastructure and Data event. In this session, we're going to start with Module 4. In Module 4, we're going to continue the conversation around migrating SQL Server into Azure. We're going to learn about the data migration tool and the data migration assistant tool that's going to really help us understand what we have and even help us start the process of migrating. And really, when we start moving our databases, we're talking about delivering change to the cloud. And then we're going to wrap up with Module 5, where we're really going to talk about how do we move into the cloud. We're really going to focus on Azure Active Directory in that module as well. So let's get started with Module 4. In Module 4, once again, we're going to start with the Data Migration Assistant, talk about how important that tool is, remind everybody about what Azure Migrate can do for us, and we're going to talk about how to migrate those databases. While the DMA provides some migration capabilities, really the best tool is something we learned in Module 3, and that is the Data Migration Services. So let's go ahead and get started with Module 4. All right, in this module, we're going to talk about how to migrate SQL workloads to Azure. And what we're going to talk about is kind of 3 big areas. We're going to once again kind of refresh on Azure SQL and the choices we have. We're going to talk about Azure Migrate, and then we're going to finish with data migration tools. Specifically, we're going to spend some time with DMA and take a look at what that tool does to feed the Azure Migrate environment and where we want to do our migrations. And so when we first talk about Azure SQL, as a reminder, we have a couple ways we can run SQL in Azure. We can do SQL on a VM, so we can just do a lift and shift, or just move the database in or the data into a SQL VM. We have SQL Managed Instance, which gives us some control over the instance, and we have Azure SQL Database, which is a full PaaS offering, where we're just moving the services. And we have Edge Computing Service, Azure SQL Edge, and really that's for, kind of IoT type of things. Point of sale systems would be an example of something you might use Azure SQL on the edge to help get that data into the databases and work with it. So really, you're going to choose, based on your plan, once again, there's that word plan, what's going to be the best landing zone. And you're going to have that all created and ready to go before we start migrating these environments into Azure. And we have lots of migration tools to help make this easy for you. Some of them are free, like Azure Migrate and the Database Migration Service, or DMS, which we saw in Module 3. And depending on how you use DMS, it might be completely free or free for a period of time as we work through these environments. And they're just designed to basically move our database up into Azure. Usually over a VPN or express route's probably the way you're going to go. A lot of our enterprise customers that I work with use express route, but you might use VPN. How long it takes, how fast is your connection, and how does that work into Azure? But in this course, and as we've gone through these modules, we really focused on SQL. But one of the things I want to tell you and show you is, that's not the only choice that we have. We actually have database migration guides for the other main databases in the world today. SQL, Oracle, DB2, SAP, MySQL, even Access, believe it or not, open source databases, NoSQL, including Dynamo and Cassandra, MongoDB, and even going into Cosmos database environments. We have the abilities to move those databases. So when you start thinking about migration, you might think, hey, look, these tools really don't apply to me because all Matt's talked about is SQL. Well, yeah, that's all I've talked about. But these other tools all work the same way. The only difference is the sources. And so there's going to be some conversation around conversion of some of that data, of changing how Oracle calls things into SQL, or some translation that goes on. But that, once again, you're going to have full preview over as we go through this module. So understand there's lots of tools that we can use to leverage inside of Azure to make this happen. From a migration perspective, we have the same kind of areas. When we start using Azure Migrate to do all of this, Azure Migrate's so awesome because it's really the central repository for any kind of scenario we can think of, whether it's a database, a VM, a web application, maybe even a virtual desktop. It has all kinds of capabilities. It can even leverage our partner community, and it's centralized. So even though we might use the data migration service to actually perform the migration for databases, the data migration assistant fills in the assessment information into Azure Migrate and informs it to let us know what our capabilities are inside of Azure. So we have lots of scenarios, and this is the beautiful thing about Azure Migrate. It doesn't care about the operating system, Windows or Linux. It doesn't care about the database, SQL or some other version of SQL. It doesn't care about how your web apps are set up. It doesn't care why your VDI is set up. It doesn't care if you're going to use DataBox. It's going to help you find all of these tools. It doesn't care if you're using VMware or Hyper-V or physical servers. It doesn't care if it's on-prem in your private cloud, if it's in AWS or GCP. It just doesn't care. It's a centralized tool that knows how to speak to all these environments, which provides a rich environment, and it's built in. It's free for us to use inside of Azure. And depending on what you're going to do and where these tools come in, all depends on the scenario. If you're doing server migration, Azure Migrate is going to do your discovery, it's going to do your assessment, it's going to do your migration. It's going to do all three. If you're going to do database migration, you're going to do your discovery is going to be stored and migrated, but you're actually going to do it inside of DMA. And we're going to take a look at DMA in just a few minutes. When you do the assessment, the data migration assistant is going to do that assessment for you. When you do the migration, even though DMA has some components, really the best service here is the data migration services that we have. And we'll see that in just a moment. For web apps, how are we going to move those web apps into Azure? We have a migration service to help move that code into the environment. We have some assessments where it's going to look at those endpoints, help us understand the code, and hopefully be able to move it. Now, app migration to me is probably the most interesting conversation. That storage is really interesting. This one really is interesting. When we talk about those web apps, and we talk about the planning process. Obviously, not everything that we do will be able to be migrated into Azure, but the cool thing about the web app process is this is where you have a chance, I should say, to change that application. You know, if it's a legacy application that's been running for 10 years, it might be in time for a refresh. And instead of doing a migration, you might do a rebuild. Now, the database is going to move. We'll migrate the database, but we're going to redesign the app to migrate it into Azure. So when we start looking at those legacy apps, do we really want to move them into Azure? Is it the best thing for the performance of the app? Or is it time to re-architect it, refactor it, maybe even rebuild it, redesign the application from the ground up? This is your chance when you start moving the different components like the database or the front end to your app into Azure. You want to start considering these things. Even if you just recently completed an app migration and actually made a brand new version of the app, maybe you don't want to move it because remember, there might be a lot of features and functionality that are inside of Azure today that you can take advantage of, but if you just move the app, you'll be oblivious to. And even in a year from now, if you just moved an app, you still might have things that you refactor into that application. So app migration is a very interesting conversation based on that app and where it comes from. But there's a lot of tooling that we have inside of Azure. The DMA, which we'll see in a little bit, is actually really nice because it feeds into Azure Migrate, and I'll show you where that is in just a moment. But the great thing about the Data Migration Assistant, it's just a free download of a tool to leverage inside the environment. And here's what it does. It assesses the database, lets you know, hey, I found a database. Here's some issues I have with the database. And then what does it do? It prepares a database and lets you know, hey, there's some fixes that you might need to do. It's then going to copy the database where we'll deploy our fixes and then finish the migration process. So we don't even modify the database we assessed. We just look at it, say we need these fixes, we fix a copy, and then send the copy up into SQL Azure SQL or managed instance. All depends on where you want to put that data inside of it. And this is a download of a tool. It does Oracle. It does some really nice environments for us to migrate from an assessment tool, and we'll see it in just a moment. But I want to refresh this a little bit on Azure Migrate, and let's actually take a look at Azure Migrate real quick. So let me hop back into my portal here. And as Azure Migrate, even on the Getting Started page, this really tells you everything it can do. Do you want databases? Do you want other scenarios that we can explore? What do we want to actually look inside the environment? Web apps, VDI, Databox, app containerization is something that's in preview. We're going to be adding to this tool set, right? Get used to seeing other options. In regards to database migration, I can either bring it, if I'm doing a lift and shift and the VM has the database on it, then I'm just doing a lift and shift. So I'm just essentially moving that server. But if I want to move just the database, we have our own tool set for that. And it'll take a second here to populate. But here I have all this information. It got this information from the Database Migration Assistant, which we'll see in just a few minutes. As a matter of fact, if I say, let's assess this environment, the tool, it says, download DMA. Create assessment project, and then use DMA to help sync this assessment summary up into Azure. That's what it does very easily inside of it. So we're actually using the tool, and it says, hey, based on what I found a database. And I found this database inside of it. It's ready for Azure SQL. It has a good compatibility level, but that's all we have to do. Right now, what do we migrate it with? Migrate the database. Talks about the database migration service on how to move that service across, which we looked at in Module 3. So let me show you, or let's talk about some of the database migration system components, and then we'll take a look at it. So when we think about the database migration services, we talked about this. It can move MySQL, Postgres, Mongo, Oracle. It can support all those environments on-prem, other clouds. It's our seamless service. And really, it's a relatively newer service to Azure from a perspective. It's designed to really do the migration. It's the best tool for migration of databases. Even though DMA has a migration component that we'll see in a moment, I'm not even going to take you through it. Why? Because I want you to use this service. It's a better, more robust service. It's fully managed. It's essentially a PaaS service designed to move databases into Azure. And that database migration service really just will look at those on-prem loads, migrate it, and move it in. And remember, as part of that assessment process, once we know it's there, we're going to apply the fixes to the copy as that's migrating. Zero downtime, which means we're not changing the on-prem database. We're just moving it up into Azure, where your applications most likely will be. Although generally with application scenarios, normally the data gets moved first, application gets moved second, make sure the application can talk to the database, and then the front end, if it's a web app or some kind of other app, gets moved last, right? Because we know all the back end's working, let's get the front end up and running, normally last. But the migration service does that all for us. We looked at those migration guides. Depending on where you're coming from, we have tools and guidance to help you be successful in your database migration. We've only focused on SQL in this course, but trust me, it's not the only game in town when it comes to databases. More importantly, here's the beautiful thing. Once you learn how to do SQL, you are going to be really familiar with the other database technologies. And it's just a matter of what do you want to move them into? How do we move them into, especially if you think something like MongoDB or even Cassandra for a second, most likely going to move that to Cosmos into Azure. Or if you just have a pure NoSQL database, we actually have a table in our storage accounts, and tables are our semi-structured database, which is those Cosmos and those Mongo types of things. So we have lots of ways to migrate. We're going to give you lots of guidance to move that information and lots of tooling under the covers. One of the ones that's really exciting, especially when it comes to SQL migration. And this is another tool. It's called the Database Experimentation Assistant. I just think it's kind of cool. Experimentation, it's kind of a fun word to say. But what it allows us to do is take those older versions of SQL and try to move them into Azure. And what we do here is we actually capture our workload. We do a trace, essentially, of what's happening in that older database. We capture that trace, and then we replay that trace on our target databases. So it might be a SQL 2008, the way the slide is, or a SQL managed instance. We replay that, and then we get a workload comparison. How does it look? If we have this legacy older database we need to move. We got to know hey, we got to experiment with it. We got to see how's it going to work on the different versions of SQL that we have at our fingertips. This is compatible with everything from SQL 2005 and newer, but it allows us to help us understand that when we move this data, it's going to work the same. Because I think every time you think about moving a database, you're worried. You hold your breath a little bit because you're not confident, hey, if I move it, is it still going to be the same data? Is it still going to work the same way? While it should, Isn't it nice to know and verify that, especially if you're moving older databases, and that's what you can do with the database experimentation assistant, my favorite word, new favorite word of the day. You create captures. You basically define a trace for a certain amount of time from a certain source environment, and then you get that all set up to go. You basically save the trace file, and then you replay it. You replay it in your target environments. You replay that, what's going to happen, whether you want to have a target in a SQL server or a managed instance, it's up to you what you replay that target into, and you simply analyze that traffic and say, hey, this particular trace worked this way in Azure, and it worked very easily. Or, oh no, we need to maybe take a look at what's going on. We're going to be able to analyze any results that come back, good, bad, or indifferent, inside of Azure. So this assistant is going to help you migrate those legacy databases into SQL Azure. And then when it's time to migrate, we talked about the app services that we can use inside of Azure to migrate this, right? So it all depends. It's kind of like, is the chicken or the egg? Which one comes first? Do you migrate the app and then the database? I would normally look at the database first, but then you can always migrate that app. It's part of our app service migrations where it does endpoint scanning when you're ready to move the app. But what do we do first? Let's actually look at the database migration assistant. This is a cool little tool that really is pretty powerful. So let's hop in to my VM with all this running, and everything's up and running in my VM. Looks good. And let me bring up the Microsoft Data Migration Assistant. Give it a second to load. And I'm just going to go ahead and make a new project. We're just going to make an assessment project. We'll call this SQL Assessment. And I probably spelled that wrong. We'll call it SQL 2. Just avoid those words that I have. What do you want to assess? The database engine or integration services? So if you have integration services on-prem, you can do that. I'm just going to choose database engine. What's my source server? Is it a SQL or AWS server? What's my target going to be? Here's your choices. Azure SQL, Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, or SQL in a VM, or just another SQL server. You can use this to migrate to other SQL servers if you need to. You have that ability. I'm just going to choose Azure SQL Database. I'm going to go ahead and create this. It's going to do a discovery and compatibility check for me. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my database environment. It's my SQL authentication here. And let me connect to that server. Oh, looks like I typed in the wrong password. There we go. Comes up, shows me my database that's in the environment. I'm going to go and add that in for us. We can even do an ad hoc query in part of this assessment. I'm just going to run the normal assessment and see what it finds. This will take just a second. It tells me that I have one compatibility issue right now. The service broker native support for where I'm going is not available in Azure SQL Database. And I can upload this to Azure SQL and it'll fill in the information. But I can also run another assessment. You know what? Azure SQL is one choice that I have for my organization. But let me do another SQL. Let me go. I'll call this one SQL 3. And let's go, instead of Azure SQL Database, let's go into a managed instance and let's create that same assessment. And let me type in the password. Hopefully we'll get it right this time. And let me connect. And same source server. Let me go ahead and click on add, and I'll start that same assessment. Hey, there's no feature parity issues. Why I'm going to managed instance? Support service broker. So when we start thinking about migration, based on where our landing zone is going to be, DMA is going to help us figure out, are we going to have issues? Now, the one thing I don't want you to do when you see this, well, hey, one I have an issue, one I don't, so I'm going to choose the one that I don't. Well, from a cost perspective, Azure SQL is a lot less expensive than Azure SQL managed instances. So why would I choose one versus the other? Once again, it's all about the app. It's all about the business need. Do you really need the service broker for your application? Yes or no? I don't know. You tell me. It's your application. So don't let just the fact there's no compatibility issues sway your decision. Let the application in your use case sway your decision. We can even see if there's any compatibility issues with this particular one. There isn't any compatibility of a possible 150 issues we can have. I'm all right. So it looks like everything's okay if I were to choose this as part of my assessment. The last part about this tool, and I just want to show you that it's there. But from a migration standpoint, we can also do a migration project here, and I'll call this SQL migration. Where's my source server? Same question. What's my target server? Azure SQL, managed instance. Now, notice even when I choose Azure SQL, it says, hey, we recommend using the DMS service. Even though we can do it here, we recommend using DMS. As a matter of fact, when I say let's go to a managed instance, DMS is the only choice that it gives me. What that means is even though we can do it to some limited need, and I think if you have smaller databases, this might be the perfect tool for it, where you don't need to stand up the database migration service. But in reality, folks, you want to leverage that service. We talked about it in Module 3. It is the better service to actually migrate those databases into Azure. And even if I do, I'll just show you what this looks like briefly. If I go ahead and create this project, it has the same kind of thing. Select your source, select your target, what tables, and then migrate the data. It's a very straightforward tool, but DMS is just a little more robust. It's a managed service, so it works a little bit better than this agent-based service. Not that this is a bad tool, but it's one tool that you can use to migrate the data. So DMA does quite a bit for us into Azure migrations. It even saves the assessments until I choose to. If I open one of the assessments up, I can actually move that up into Azure. I can do a lot of work here. So if I open the assessment here, I have the ability to upload this and just give Azure more information when I'm doing my database migration. Once again, that shows up in the Azure Migrate tool. So DMA, nice little tool to do that assessment process, and then we'll use DMS to actually move that data into one of the many locations inside of Azure. So great little tool for us to use. Once again, as we take a look at this content, I mentioned it in Module 3, but I'm going to mention it again in Module 4. We have an online learning path, all about the different data fundamentals that we have in Azure. You're going to want to know our different storage locations, just from the basics of a storage account to our non-relational data with things like NoSQL and Cosmos, to our fully relational databases, things like SQL Server, and how do we move those? You're going to want to know what it looks like inside of Azure. Why? Before you start this migration, as a part of that planning, once again, planning again, you're going to want to know what your choices are. As an architect, as an engineer, as a database administrator, you want to know what are your choices or where you're going to move your data, what they're good at, where their limitations are, and what's going to be ultimately the best place to put your information. So whenever we talk about database migration, understand your different choices. And like I mentioned in Module 3, we'll mention again here, there is a certification all about database administration. So if that's what you do 24/7, that's a great accreditation to get if you so desire. So that brings us to the end of Module 4. Hope you enjoyed talking about DMA and Azure Migrate. So in Module 4, we learned about DMA, we got a refresher on Migrate, and we really talked about the power of migrating the databases. We even took a quick peek that these tools are not just for SQL, but for DB2, for your NoSQL databases, for your Oracle databases, for everything in between. We can really migrate that data. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and we'll see everyone back, and then we will start Module 5.